the full phrase, and it's intentional, and I'll explain why in a second, is enabling buying in a world of selling. And the reason we are very deliberate about that phrase is the second part cannot be ignored, which is there is a world of selling. It's the traditional world of selling. And anytime people start saying things that sound very altruistic or ideal, like, put the buyer first, put your ego, check your ego at the door, all these kind of what I call cereal box phrases that you hear all the time, do nothing to really acknowledge, in my mind, that the world of selling is necessary, meaning there's a numbers game to it.
Welcome to Narrative's Leadership Story Talks, where great leaders go beyond the bottom line to create lasting impact. Join hosts Jerome Deroy and Julienne Ryan as they uncover the stories behind real-world challenges, offering practical insights to help you lead with empathy, authenticity, and purpose. Each episode dives into how leaders use storytelling to build trust, foster connection, and inspire action. Whether you're navigating workplace dynamics, driving change, or building high-performing teams.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome Deroy, CEO of Narrative.
I'm Julienne Ryan, and happy to be here.
Great, good to see you, Julienne. Now, before we move on to introducing our guest, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast, Leadership Story Talks, wherever you find your podcasts. And you can also check out our YouTube channel because we post on the Narrative YouTube channel. And of course, you can go to narrative.com/podcast. That's NARATIV.com/podcast, where you can find all of our previous episodes of more than 140 episodes at this point. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest, Charles Bernard, a sales improvement expert, a keynote speaker, founder of Criteria for Success and Collavia, two organizations that are transforming how companies grow and engage clients. With over 20 years in sales, leadership, and consulting, Charles helps businesses align strategy with modern buyer behavior. A former top performer at GE, he now champions this phrase that I love, which is enabling buying, a client-first approach to sales. His expertise spans revenue growth, cross-functional collaboration, and strategic planning. He's a world traveler and triathlete. Charles brings a lot of energy, insight, and results to every engagement. And just as a side note, Charles and I have known each other for many, many years. I was in one of your workshops years and years ago. You were in one of the first workshops that Narrative ever held in New York City. Gosh, a long time ago. I'm not going to date it too much because it's getting a little much. But yeah, I'm just so delighted to have you on our podcast, and I can say that you have been a true friend of Narrative, and I really feel very privileged that we can have this conversation and release it to the public. So welcome.
Thank you. The feeling's mutual, by the way, Jerome, and thank you for the opportunity, Jerome and Julienne. I'm thrilled to be here.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So I want to kick things off the way that we always kick these episodes off. We're going to get into the more personal side of our guest today. And to ask you this question, what is an experience that you've had that has shaped who you are today, that still continues to informs your thinking, your work perhaps, or influences you in some way?
I'll go back to my early 20s when I left England, where I grew up, and came to the US. And indeed, I was working for General Electric as a software engineer and a systems architect. So very technical. And I was working on an account, Mobil Oil, which later became ExxonMobil when they merged. But this was before they merged, and it was in New York City. And so everything was new to me. And I was a little green, but very committed to my work. I remember being very serious about it. And one day I'm in the cafeteria and I overhear some chat about a big project that's just got funded. I bring that information back to GE, and my boss at the time, Tony Casa, who was a mentor, gave me very little direction. He said, get us on the bid list. That was it. So with that great instruction, I started bouncing around like a pinball in the executive suite at Mobile. I had access because I was already inside the building. And I found the person I was looking for, literally stumbled into his office. And I had no script. I'd never sold anything before. And so I asked him if I could talk about his project, which he immediately denied. What project? And I said, I'm sorry to have wasted your time. I kind of put my tail between my legs, and I don't want to tell you what was going through my head at the time, but it wasn't great. I was wondering if he was going to escort me out. And as I turned, he said something strange. He said, well, you're a very brash young man. Why don't you come in and tell me about yourself? So kind of like two conflicting comments. Did he want me to come back and talk to him, or did he want to make a point that I was brash? No. Come in, sit, talk. So he asked me about my background. And then right at the end, he said, if I were funding a big project and was looking for support, how would you staff it? What would you do? Mm. And I said the first thing that was in my head, I would do everything to make you successful. And from that one comment, fast forward where we did a proposal, a ton of research, he asked us to come in and pitch as one of the finalists. So we had submitted our proposal, and GE had brought down the top brass, as they were known, like the president of the division I was in. And when we get to go to the office, there are two banks of elevators. Bank number one is where my office was, which was on the 7th floor. And bank number two was the elevator that went to the 46th floor where the executive suite was. And I get a pat from Tony, my mentor. Great job, Charles. We'll take it from here. And coincidentally, I think my whole life turned around the one small event, which was the elevator door to the 46th floor opening before my elevator door. They walk in, and I find myself in this kind of out of body experience, walking in with them.
Good
and
for
I hear
you.
this voice, this 20-year-old voice with these executives crammed in this small elevator, and the voice is saying, if it's okay with you, I'd like to come along. Then I realize it's my voice that's saying that. We get to Irv K is the executive at Mobil Oil. We get to the executive suite. It's a huge suite back in the day, and there's a couch, and my boss grumbles, sit on the couch, be quiet, take notes. Okay. And then they proceed to sell Irv on this proposal for this multi-million-dollar deal. And now looking back, they did everything I would advocate you do not do in sales. But I didn't know at the time. But all they kept talking about was GE, how big a company we were, how unlimited our resources were, how magnificent our consultants were, how the best and the brightest came to work at GE, blah, 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 blah. And this went on for a couple of minutes. And I'll never forget, this is the pivotal moment you had asked me about. Irv does one of these, and he says, if it's okay with you, you see that guy sitting on the couch over there? That's the only reason you're in this office. And if it's okay with you, I'd like him to bring us a chair to this meeting and sit at the table where they were sitting. And the rest was a blur. I mean, but to answer your question, Jerome, the thing that stuck with me is how somebody can have the foresight to literally make a career, which is what happened to me, in an instant. Mm-hmm. No one had ever advocated for me, not even my own father, who, that's another story, but just having somebody who, as a leader, picked somebody that he felt, and later he told me why, he felt would move heaven and earth to get him what he needed. And he didn't feel the same way from the rest of the team. So I know that's a long-winded response, but it's definitely one of those pivotal moments in my life that shaped who I am. And I got into sales as a result of that. Because from that day onward, I was no longer doing technical work. I was a sales account executive, and that involved bringing in more consultants, which is obviously more billing.
Amazing.
So I'm raising my hand to anybody who can't see me right now because stories create pictures in our mind and we have split screens in our heads, kind of rethinking about experiences we've had. But you literally gave a great story that has one of the two most important visuals we always talking about. You got into the room with the people and you literally got a seat at the table, which we're always talking about in our session. Like, how do we become a leader? How do we raise our voice and get a seat at the table? So you have a story that people will not forget. And it's such an important one about taking that one step and literally crossing over into the elevator and then I hope the doors shut quickly so they can't let me out. So lots of acts of courage and, just great energy and saying, well, I got this far. Let me just keep taking one step forward. So awesome.
Yeah. And the idea of someone, this is something we talk a lot about as well. What people say to us, what people notice about us, and then they reflect that back. And that moment, when that person, the first time they notice you, and then the second time during the meeting, they're like, that's the person who needs to be at the table, nobody else. And you really do need that, in terms of being able to, I mean, it's one thing to be able to advocate for yourself, but the reality is that, yes, you should be able to do that. But the reality is that you also need, people in positions of leadership already to advocate for you. And so in order for that to happen, they need to have the awareness of what's going on around them and the kinds of people that are around them, not just the C-suite. It's amazing that a kind of coincidental encounter almost led to that moment where it could have been, you should leave the office right now. But instead, that person had the wherewithal to say, you know what, there might be something to this person. And so that's interesting to me. And I want to build a little bit on that because there's a couple of things that I certainly would love to get your perspective on it. And the two things are really around this idea of enabling buying, because you mentioned that in that room, they were doing all the things that you tell your clients not to do, and all the things that you learned, to not do. And then as I was reading your bio, and every time I meet you, you always mention this phrase of enabling buying. And then the other, I said there would be two parts, but the other part is more your insights on leadership. But I'd love to start with just that piece of what do you mean by enabling buying, and how is that different from what you were just describing? We're the best, we're the biggest, we're the brightest, and that's why you should buy from us. And clearly that doesn't work.
Yeah. So this has been a passion for a long time, as you know, Jerome. The full phrase, so that's half the phrase. The full phrase, and it's intentional, and I'll explain why in a second, is enabling buying in a world of selling. And the reason we are very deliberate about that phrase is the second part cannot be ignored, which is there is a world of selling. It's the traditional world of selling. And anytime people start saying things that sound very altruistic or ideal, like, put the buyer first, put your ego, check your ego at the door, all these kind of what I call cereal box phrases that you hear all the time, do nothing to really acknowledge, in my mind, that the world of selling is necessary, meaning there's a numbers game to it. How many events do you schedule? How many appointments? How many proposals? How many leads? The pressure that a sales manager will put on their salesperson to perform, that doesn't go away when you start thinking enabling buying. So it's almost like enabling buying is an overlay. And that's why I want to be deliberate about those two parts to the phrase. The best way I can describe, I think, as succinctly as possible, what it really means is to think about, and we've said this to many, many salespeople, and it's amazing. We've gone from lots of talking about describing it to really one question or two questions. And when people really take the question seriously, they get what it means. And so I'll pose it to you kind of rhetorically, which is one question, then the second question. The first question is, most salespeople, if they really want to transform the ability to enable buying, is to ask what's necessary for the buyer to buy right now. The second part to that question is what happens in the world of selling, which is what's necessary for me to make a sale right now. And if you ask yourself those questions, I would argue, and I've seen it happen myself and many other people I've spoken to, that that simple pivot away from what's needed for me to make a sale opens up a whole sequence of follow-on questions and behaviors when you ask what's needed for the buyer to buy right now. Like, maybe I should ask a question. Maybe I should give a presentation that's relevant. If I were in the buyer's shoes, maybe I should blah, blah, as opposed to maybe to get a sale, I need to close this deal quickly, or I need to get another meeting or view this as a transaction. And I would argue most of that, unfortunately, that pressure we put on ourselves to perform is anxiety based and survival based. So that's another long-winded description of what that phrase means.
Mm. I mean, I love that. And I wonder, in terms of that shift that you just described, moving away from what do I need to make this sale, and really thinking about what's necessary for the buyer. And then the second part of the question, this world of selling that we're in. I wonder, in terms of clients that you've worked with, whether there's one, I mean, I'm sure there's more than one that sort of stand out, but for the purpose of this podcast, if there's one that stands out in terms of that shift, where this sort of, maybe they had like an aha moment of, right, yes, we've been doing it this way, but look what happens when we do it the way that, Charles and the criteria for Success and Collavia team have shown us how to do it. Does anything stand out?
Yes, it does, Jerome. I have a great client that we worked with fairly recently, a couple of years ago, actually. The name of the company is Knox Health, and they're in the sleep wellness space. So they are, in my mind, the number one leading sleep wellness provider. And if you ask yourself, who doesn't need good sleep, right? And what was happening, so I and my team, so there's a team of us, were asked to come in and work in a sort of fractional sales leadership capacity, VP of sales capacity. Side note, what I discovered is that most of the early part of the engagement was really conflict resolution as opposed to working on sales. Like, in other words, enabling buying also puts the buyer at the center of the organization, which means the buyer isn't owned just by sales. You've got marketing, operations, and there was a lot of kind of communication flow that needed to be improved there. But back to the question, the breakthrough, I think, was a result of the shift in the way they were selling their program. So think about it. You're selling something that on the surface everybody wants. Like, who doesn't want good sleep? And they were selling to employers. And what was happening early on is there was a lot of talk about the benefit of sleeping. And if you had employees who slept better, they performed better. The problem was you were talking to HR professionals, CFO professionals, who, while they are committed to good health in their organizations, what's top of mind for them is healthcare costs in their organization. Like if you go to an Amazon, it's spending tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in health services to their employees. And so we created this relatively simple shift, and we had the data to back it up. That's why these guys are so good, because they've been doing this for a long time. They're from Iceland, actually. Very disciplined. You can kind of picture this leadership group that is very clinical, very precise, and they had amassed all this data. And so we said to them, what do you do with all that data? Well, it's important when we provide the value of the program after the sale, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, what about before the sale? What do you mean? Well, can you plot the cost savings with your data on healthcare costs? And the aha moment came with the one place their sleep wellness program impacted the most was chronic conditions. And chronic conditions like heart problems, obesity, depression, yada, yada, right? There's a whole bunch of chronic cases. Those account for about 60% of the spend of a healthcare program or healthcare across the board. And so they said, we can literally show you with our data, if you provide us your demographics of your employee population, we can project that we can cut between 10 and 15 million off your health spend, for example. Who's not going to listen to that?
I was thinking that.
I mean,
Gave him pause.
right? I'm a CFO and I've got to maintain profit, and I've got to show that we're doing everything possible to keep the business healthy financially. And I got the benefit of all this sleep wellness. So the selling changed dramatically from let's tell you how great our program is to let's tell you the impact, financial impact of our program. And we targeted chronic conditions, and all the presentations went right after that, and the results were there.
Amazing. And I love that example because it's taking this very sort of big thing that we know we all need. Obviously, you asked the question, who doesn't need good sleep? But then by finding that specific item that really relates to the buyer, that I can see how that's enabling buying, because now I'm like, oh yeah, sure, having good sleep is nice, but look at how much we're paying in healthcare and all this stuff. That's my main worry, actually. I'm not so worried about I'm probably losing sleep over how many millions I'm spending in healthcare, and here somebody's telling me that actually we're going to cut those costs, so I'll probably sleep better because of that, right? So yeah, I love that example. Thank you for that. One of the things that I'm also thinking about, because I know, when we were talking previously outside of the podcast, and I've seen you post about this on LinkedIn, et cetera. You're someone who's had a variety of different sort of leadership roles in different contexts, through crises, through change, and here you are. And I mean, congratulations on that longevity as a CEO, as a leader. And I think I want to go a little bit into what you've learned about that, because I've heard you speak about, I think it was philosophy and mechanics when we look at the way that you look at leadership. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, about this difference between philosophy and mechanics, and maybe how do we need to bring those together? How does that all work in your mind?
I love the question. And I think now that I'm thinking about it, because I don't always think about it every day, but now that I'm thinking about why do we have this term? I can't think of a thing that gives meaning to anything we do that doesn't fold into philosophy and mechanics. And I'll give you an example, and then I'll reference Simon Sinek, right? Because he would probably agree on the philosophy part. So the way I look at it, very, very, very high level, not just sales, but anything. If you're doing anything meaningful in a job, for example, but you don't even have to be in a job. You do anything meaningful. What gets you out of bed in the morning and energized, I would argue, is philosophy. Simon Sinek would probably say it's your why. So what is your philosophical outlook on what you're speaking on behalf of for an organization? If you're a salesperson, are you talking about something relevant to the buyer? Because that's really enabling buying also. It's got to be relevant. If I go into some place and just talk about what I've been trained to talk about, then it's not relevant, doesn't matter. And worse, it's not relevant and I don't believe in it, that's horrible. So the philosophy aspect is we want to, you could probably say it's like mission, core values, if you really want to boil it down to that level. But philosophy was discovered actually in my organization because we were really getting at what we're doing trainings. What makes people absorb a training? And one philosophy that kind of changed everything was learning replaces training. And I had a lot of trainers working for me that I love. I love training trainers, by the way. I don't know if you know that about me, but a lot of trainers get caught up. We discovered this with Dale Carnegie because we had hired some of their people to kind of substitute for us, and we watched how they were trained. And what we realized is that a lot of people are in the curriculum delivery business. And I would argue we're not in the curriculum delivery business because that's all about us imparting knowledge to you. Just because I tell you something doesn't mean you absorbed it. So we started to realize that we would give people a common philosophy and then they would apply the mechanics individually. So common philosophy would be tell a story in selling, like you guys. We will give you the construct of a story, but how people adapted that into their worldview was really kind of mechanical as well. But once they got the concept, the philosophy, so they go together. In other words, everything we do has to have a reason. That's the philosophy, and we train on reasons. And one other reason, again, in enabling buying is we worked with one company. I won't name them, but they were very big, and they had your stereotypical. They had thousands of salespeople. I'll tell you the profile, and you'll get it right away. They hired them from colleges where they were jocks. They were either the quarterback, the captain of a team. These were people that would punch through brick walls to get the job done. Navy SEAL types. And the problem is they got a reputation in the industry for being super aggressive, and they had a product that was really great. And so buyers were buying despite the aggression of the salespeople. But it really got under the CEO's skin, and he brought us in. And we're like, how do we train 6,000 people? It's going to take forever. And so we really needed to learn something that we could give to a group and then have it spread like a virus. So we didn't literally have to fly to every single city. It would take us years to train these people. So one concept we came up with, which is philosophy, is let's distinguish between aggressive and assertive. And the way I'm going to do that is paint an imaginary line on the carpet in front of me. So imagine I'm standing in front of people training. On this side of the line is aggressive, which is rude, cocky, inappropriate. On that side of the line is assertive, which is being professional, asking tough questions that you're empowered to ask, but you've got to be appropriate. You can put your toes on the line, but you should never cross the line into aggression. And so that little philosophy seemed to just resonate. And so then people would say, we got the philosophy, how do you do it? And then the how was, here's how you run a meeting, you do bonding and rapport, and you do all these different steps, you set goals at the first. But I feel if you don't impart the philosophy first, mechanics on their own tend to be swimming in the ether. There's no way to connect the dots. And so the philosophy helps do that. Gives meaning to what you do.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have my hand raised again. But I'm going to also layer that. So you have your philosophy, you have your mechanics, but you're also, just by that example, giving context, because you gave a great example of what the situation and what the outcome was when they were operating in a certain way. The same way you gave context with your first story about how'd you get here story, when you said, well, this is informed my experience, where I learned intuitively or just by just how you were, what was important to the client and what problem they were trying to fix, as opposed to coming with your brand flags and, all your shiny brochures. So I think the context is what sells quietly. And that's what the beauty of the storytelling and giving these anecdotes, because sales are everywhere, but it's the human part of it. Like, what informed your approach and what informed it? And so we're saying the same thing, but I think that word context is always such a powerful tool, because then you go, all right, now I get him. What lights him up and gets him going in the morning. So there you go.
I love it. I think there's a speaker, I forgot who he is, who's famous for talking about what you just said. I read it somewhere, and he said, let me give you an example of context. You've got fish talking to each other, and one says, do you like the water we're swimming in? And the other says, what water? And I think the example is context is invisible, and yet it shapes everything you do. Because the moment you start thinking about it, it's almost like you could drive yourself crazy, because there's no end to it. But I totally agree. I think context is really powerful, and I think it's probably back to the question on leadership. I think context is one of those things that when we're working with leaders, they tend to forget they have the ability to shape context or influence
Hmm.
context, and that would drive a lot of behavior on their teams.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's a bit like when I can also relate to that in terms of when we're, teaching people or training people how to tell their story. There's a lot of things that we say, which are our principles and guiding lights for you to get there. But if there isn't that idea of why do I need a story and why now? Why do you need a story? Why now? If we always start with that question, because if the person doesn't actually have a clear statement for themselves, or they're repeating something that we said, well, here's why we have story, here's why we tell stories and why it works, then I know that it's not going as deep into their bones as it might. So I really relate to that. Gosh, we're almost out of time. Time is flying by, but there is one question on my mind. I want to get to this because when we spoke last time, you talked about your team and this anecdote you gave us, which is that I think you started one of your meetings with the question, what's your favorite travel destination and why?
Yeah.
And that got us to think about culture and team culture. And I'm just curious about your view on that, on sort of how do you make these, because I think what you had said at the time is that it sort of created this unexpected connection between people. But is that something that you came into that meeting thinking about, or did it just sort of come to you to say, you know what, I want to ask this question now? I'm wondering how much of that is intentional on your part to sort of look for ways to create connection within your team.
I'll give you a little bit of a philosophical answer and a little bit of a mechanical
Of
answer.
course you
Yeah,
will.
well, there you
Of
go.
course it.
Would expect nothing less.
You're consistent. Another great important C word.
So I would love to take credit for having thought it through ahead of time, but mostly, like a lot of things, trial and error. Some things work, some things don't. And so it just happened to be an idea that I had that didn't have much thought, but there was a kind of authenticity to it. I know that's a big word that gets thrown around a lot, but it just felt right to say, you know what, I think we need to talk about, we're so project focused as a team, my team especially. Like, I can't imagine many other teams that are as disciplined as we are. We use Basecamp, we use Collavia, we use goals, we track everything. And we almost never talk about ourselves. And it just seemed like a good thing at the time to do. So the mechanics part is give people a little bit of a framework and lots of latitude. So the framework was, travel destinations, somewhere that is on your bucket list. And so it was pretty much left wide open, but with a couple of little qualifiers in there. That would be some mechanics. But I'll tell you, Jerome, where something very similar happened that was an epiphany moment with another client that was all about the mechanics. And that is they're in the health space. And they almost never talked about the virtue of what they did. They would internally, they were driven by the numbers. How many calls did you make? How many? And the salespeople were getting really worn down. And so we did a workshop on why do you sell this stuff? And you know what emerged was everything that happened when we asked what was your favorite destination. We discovered that many of these people, in fact, most of them, I'd say at least 9 out of 10, said that they had a family member, a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, a child who had some health crisis that what they were selling could solve. And I kept thinking, why are we not talking more about that? And so this idea of the vacation, and it could be anything like the other example, or it could be many other things, is an opportunity to give people a forum to express themselves in a sort of meaningful, structured way. You don't want to get too wide because you don't know what you're going to get, but you don't get too narrow where you're controlling the conversation.
Yeah. It's the difference between telling someone, just tell me something about yourself. And, probably half the room just freezes.
I know,
right?
I know.
So, but when you ask a question that's so specific, and it starts with what, and you ask why, I think that automatically brings me to a particular place. And I love that example of the company you were talking about that's in the health space. We've had that experience too, with life sciences, and so many people have that sense of purpose and mission because of something that happened in their life. And I would venture to say that in all of our years, of working with a variety of different organizations, you can always find that connection somewhere. And it's just about asking those right questions. So I love the way you framed that. Unfortunately, we are going to have to land this plane and stop here, but before we go, I want to ask you, Charles, if there's anything you want to leave our audience with. I know we've got websites and links that we're happy to put into the episode notes for everyone who wants to learn more. But is there anything you want to leave with our audience right now?
Well, I'll say thank you first. I've really appreciated the time and the opportunity to speak and tell you a little bit about, answer your questions. I really appreciate that very much. In terms of a little plug on us, I'd say go to LinkedIn and look for the hashtag enabling buying in a world of selling, all one word. And you'll get a lot of what we've been talking about here, as well as many other things that I've been posting and other members of my team. Or if you want to go to hashtag Collavia LLC, either one of those will give you good insights. I'd send you to the website, but that's more of a brochure. That's criteriaforsuccess.com and Collavia.com. But I think going to LinkedIn and looking up those hashtags, you'll get a bunch of posts on all different concepts and ideas about what it really means to put the buyer in the middle, what it really means to have your organization collaborate. So that's my plug for the day.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yes, listeners, I encourage you to go and check that out because I can testify that these resources really transformative, and as you've heard in all the examples we heard today. But definitely go and check out those hashtags and websites, and we'll have those in our episode notes as well, so that you can find those easily. I want to thank you both. Thank you, Charles, for being here, taking the time, and your willingness to share these stories with us. And thanks, Jules, for being my wonderful co-host, as always.
And I want to land on one last thing. I think, Charles, what you've been describing is going to open up possibilities for people who are going to, whether they're in the sales capacity or just selling about themselves in their daily life, just open up how they're thinking about that whole process. So
Yeah,
thank
I
you
hope
so
it
much.
does.
Great. Well, speaking of opening yourself up to new ways of thinking, I also want to do a plug for a new partnership that we have at Narrative, which is with the New Mexico State University's Global Campus. We've created an on-demand, self-paced storytelling course where you'll learn how to find, craft, and present the stories that you need to tell for different kinds of purpose. And you can learn more by going to our website, narativ.com, under resources. And especially for people who are listening right now, you can get a special 25% discount on the fee if you put in code NARRATIVE, NARATIV. That's only for you listeners, because we really appreciate you coming to us and listening to this podcast. And we'll have the link in the episode notes. So thanks, everyone. And if there's anything else that you all want to learn about, we're always ready to listen to you. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, as always. Leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, and also go onto our YouTube channel to see us in living color. So until next time, thanks, Julienne, again for co-hosting.
Thank you,
Charles.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.